Welcome to Unit 5, Land and Water Use. Um, this unit is massive, and so it's going to be broken up into many parts. This first part, we're just going to kind of introduce some themes that we've probably already gone through, and then also take a look at forestry. I am going in order that I think makes sense, where we'll look at more unsustainable practices and then move into what's more sustainable. College Board does not follow this um, order, so it's going to be a little scattered as College Board unit guide goes. But as per usual, I have all of the essential knowledge points and the topics as we go through the PowerPoint. So keep your eyes on those. Just the order that I'm about to do makes more sense to me. So before we really start Unit 5, we're going to talk about tragedy of the commons once again. We've talked about it in the past, but this is really how we use land and resources. And honestly, you know, it ends up being a true tragedy of the commons. So if you remember, tragedy of the commons is really an overuse or misuse of common property. And so you end up having environmental degradation of renewable resources. Like our cod stocks here in this graph, you can see that really in the 1960s, we have this increase in mechanization um, of fishing, and we had to put in less effort to get more catch. And that led to a massive spike in the number of fish that were caught, but it collapsed because it was overused. And so there weren't enough fish really to sustain the population. Logging, right? So we're looking at timber use or fossil fuel use, like oil, you can see there. But basically, if someone says, it's okay if I just use some for me, and then everyone says that, it's all going to add up in the end. And so, um, you know, people say, who are people? Well, whoever. But basically, they say that, the solution is either regulating um, resource use or privatizing. So, who owns the land? If you own something, you're more likely to take care of it and keep it sustained or if there are regulations in place, you're limited as to how much you can actually use. So those are ways that we can kind of avoid or fix tragedy of the commons.
Again, here are your um, essential knowledge points. Remember, you want to pause these or go back to these and take a look at these essential knowledge points because these are really the things that you need to know. But anyway, moving on to topic 511, ecological footprint. We did an ecological footprint. And if you remember what it asked you all about your lifestyle and your transportation needs, your house, um, about products, your resource use that you use for products, the types of food that you eat, and all different kinds of parts of your lifestyle. And basically, it's measuring how fast we're consuming these resources and it compare it to how fast nature can actually absorb our waste or generate new resources for us to use. And usually it is not equal. Even if you are in a good place, maybe you use more than one earth. So if everyone on earth lived just like you, how many earths would you need? And more than likely, yours is more than one. But we only have one earth. And so when we look at our ecological footprint, it kind of makes us think about, hey, how can we mitigate what our resource use is doing to? And so we really want to go towards more sustainability. And again, here are your essential knowledge points about sustainability. But right, you have these indicators of sustainability and looking at how good or bad we're doing at how sustainable our lifestyle is, or as a human population, really, right? So if we're looking at biological diversity, um, if you have a high biological diversity, we're doing pretty good. If it's a low biological diversity, not so good, right? Food production, well, food production, if we are feeding the people on Earth, then that's a good thing. But are we doing it sustainably? Looking at our carbon dioxide emissions and climate change, if those are on the lower side, then our sustainability is in a good part, right? We're able to sustain that lifestyle. Whereas if we're going to keep on increasing global temperatures through carbon dioxide emissions, then that's not so sustainable. And so you can take a look at this table. You can see it's directly from your book, Table 2.2. And basically, when we talk about sustainability and looking at our resources, we talk about sustainable yield. And it's the amount of a resource that can be taken without reducing the available supply. So if you take too much, there isn't going to be enough later. Um, Whereas if you take too little, there'll be plenty. Um, but as humans, we want to take the maximum amount that we can take and still have plenty of resources left over. And so you want to take the number of resources that's optimal for whatever we're talking about. Here in the picture, it's fish, as we usually talk about, right, when we talk about tragedy of the commons and whatnot. But any any resource, so water, timber, whatever it may be.
So now that we've set up, tragedy of the commons and overuse and misuse of resources, we are going to start with forestry and look at clear cutting. And then on the flip side, we will take a look at what is a more sustainable way of this practice. So I tried to just set you up with tragedy of the commons, moving into sustainability. And so here we have our tragedy of clear cutting, and afterwards we'll look at the more sustainable practice of sustainable forestry. So clear cutting, basically removing almost all of the trees within an area. And so mostly this is done through creating cattle ranching areas or rangeland. But also obviously they use the timber products when they do this. If these areas are replanted with new trees, that area is actually exposed to full sunlight. So you end up with a completely different species. And if you replant, all those trees are really the same age. And so, maybe you go into a tree plantation at that point or not. So it depends on what you're using the land for. And so clear cutting is obviously very easy because you're just doing it all in one shot. And it's very economical because you can just cut it down and sell it. And so, it's not as much effort. So it doesn't cost as much. But there are obviously consequences to clear cutting forests. And so one of them being soil erosion. If the trees aren't there to hold the soil in place, then erosion can happen super easily. Not only that, right, the runoff, so when there's precipitation, runoff can run down and not get caught up by the trees, so that the trees aren't there to actually take up the water, and so therefore erosion is increased because runoff is also increased. And so all of that, right, runs into a nearby water body, and you have sedimentation. Sedimentation is not good for aquatic life. You have photosynthetic plants that can't get sunlight if the water is too murky, or the gills of fish get all clogged up with sediment. Not just fish, right, but anything that breathes with gills. Um, your temperature increases in your soil and water temperature because you have shade, right? There's increased sunlight there. Like I said, you have an increase of runoff into surface water, and also you have the increase in volume into surface water because the forest isn't there to actually take the water in. Um, Perhaps obvious is habitat loss and fragmentation. Habitat's gone because we took it away, but also any roads that are built, or also if we take those, um, lumber areas in patches, you end up with fragmentation. So there's a decrease in connectivity between habitat areas or ecosystems, and organisms are not able to interbreed, or maybe some organisms have a large range, and that's reduced by causing that fragmentation. And then, of course, you also have these roads that are coming in and out of the area, which is causing soil compaction. So that means that the infiltration rate of the soil will actually go down. So not only, right, we have these like very obvious effects um, on the environment, but just the services in general that are lost for us as humans, right? Um, Forests or trees absorb and filter air and water for us. So they provide us with clean air and water. If they're not there, we lose that. If the trees aren't there to sequester carbon through photosynthesis, then what ends up happening is that we have an increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that gives us, climate change, which obviously affects humans. We'll talk about more in Unit 9. But not only does it not sequester carbon, but after the clear cut, a lot of times they burn the remaining vegetation. And so just that combustion of vegetation is releasing even more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere.
So finally, we're going to talk about sustainable forestry. So we obviously are going to use lumber, but how can we do that sustainably? And so one way to mitigate what's already been done is to replant or reforest deforested areas. We could reuse wood to decrease the amount of wood that we're actually using. And also, we could buy from um, companies that are using sustainable methods. So, what does sustainable methods actually look like? Well, um, if an area has been clear cut, you can actually plant them with plantations. And so you end up with a stand of trees that are all the same age. These are sun tolerant species, and then you can clear cut them all again and plant them again. So you're actually, growing trees to be cut down. Um, there's also selective cutting, so where you're removing a smaller number of trees at a time, and then your stand is different ages, so you might be able to harvest in the same area at different times. This is really only good for shade tolerant species because obviously you have trees that are left that are providing shade for your new trees. And sustainable forestry really is just harvesting trees in a way that allow these species to regenerate and ensure that the ecological health is maintained and restored, and maybe even enhanced. Imagine that. That'd be awesome. And so, depending on where you are in the world, your harvest plan is going to be different. For example, small scale clear cutting is actually not so bad in deciduous forest areas. That's where we are, because it's mimicking natural disturbance, small scale. Um, whereas, right, other areas that might not be very good. But another thing in a plan, a sustainable forestry plan, is you really need to think about the number of trees that are harvested per acre to keep your forest healthy and happy. Um, how often can you harvest a certain species? Some species grow faster than others. And then also any logging techniques to minimize impacts. You can hand cut your trees, or Um, some some companies are actually going to like horse and buggies to bringing um, the lumber out of the forest so that way they don't have to build roads. So, right, these are sustainable ways that you can actually harvest lumber products. Another thing to manage your forest is using something called a prescribed burn. So you want to make sure that the biomass underneath your canopy is burned off. So natural fires are actually a thing, and they're good in small scales, and it actually keeps the amount of biomass down, and so it reduces that risk of uncontrolled fires. But another plus about this is that it adds nutrients to the soil. So it allows for early succession species, which increases biodiversity. And obviously, adding nutrients to the soil is never a bad thing.
So, in managing a forest stand that you want to actually harvest, you obviously are going to have pests because that is just part of the business of growing something and trying to, harvest and sell it. You're going to have pests. And one way to do that sustainably is something through is through something called integrative pest management. So integrative pest management is basically using every method possible before you use chemical pesticides. So chemical pesticides are the very last resort. There are certain ways that we can do it so we can avoid having the pest in the first place. And so we call this more of a cultural thing where if anyone's ever gone camping, they limit out of state firewood. And the reason why is because invasive species such as this emerald ash borer hitchhikes on the firewood and you bring it into the area and it can affect all the trees around it. That is not good. And so by limiting out of state or out of area products, you can limit your exposure to these invasive species. However, let's say we do get a pest. One thing that we can do is we can actually remove the affected trees. You can see here, this is an affected tree on the bottom here. This cute little emerald ash borer does a lot of damage, and ash is very good for retail purposes. And so you really don't want to lose your ash stand because this boring activity underneath the bark will actually end up to loss and death of the tree. And so by removing the affected trees, if you catch it early enough, you hopefully can catch enough of those ash borers that the other trees around it won't be affected. Um, the next thing is a biocontrol. So basically, I put out some sort of biological control of the pest. So there's actually a parasitoid wasp that lays its larva inside the ash borer and kills them. And so there are people who release this wasp in the areas of the ash borer that ultimately, right, will kill off your pest. So you're releasing a living organism to help you with a pest that you want to manage. That comes at a risk, which we will talk about again more when we get to integrated pest management in agriculture. And one other thing we could do is something called a biopesticide. I'm actually not sure about a biopesticide in terms of the emerald ash borer, but what I will tell you is that there is, we use bacteria like Bacillus thuringiensis or BT that you can basically spray on your crop or whatever it is or your tree to then kill off whatever pests there are. And so, but it's a biological pesticide. It's not a chemical pesticide, which again, integrated pest management is everything you can do before you use chemical pesticides because chemical pesticides are not sustainable. And so thus concludes the very first part of this massive Unit 5. So I'll see you at the next one.